Hi, I'm Rachel Miller, author of the new In All Thy Ways devotional journal, and I would like to welcome you to the second segment of our devotional journaling tips. I hope it's a blessing. In our last segment, we talked about the question, what does today's passage teach me about God's desires? Today we're going to be looking at what does today's passage teach me about God's ways? Again, this is a very simple topic, but we're going to look at 5 different questions that can help bring a little more depth to the subject. Last week I was studying Exodus chapter 3 for a couple of different projects. You're probably familiar with the story of Moses and the burning bush, but just in case, let's recap. Moses was on the backside of the wilderness watching his father-in-law's sheep when all of a sudden he sees a bush that's burning, but it isn't burning up. So, of course, curiosity gets the better of him and he turns aside to see what it is. When he does, God speaks to him out of the bush. God tells him about the affliction of his people in their captivity in Egypt, and then he tells Moses that he wants to send him to talk to Pharaoh to secure their release. Talk about a huge assignment. But as I was studying, I was especially impressed by the way that God dealt with his people in this situation. And not only with his people, but also with the Egyptians. So let's look at 5 different things, 5 questions that can bring a little more depth to the story. The first question is, how did God deal with his people? First of all, we see that he dealt with Moses individually and directly. This is important to remember because he deals with us in the same way. He also dealt with the people of Israel as a whole, and he dealt with them through Moses. This is also important because he does the same with the church and its leaders today. Question number 2. Which of God's characteristics do we see in his dealings? We actually see several of God's characteristics in this story, but 3 in particular caught my attention. The first is holiness. We see this as God required Moses to remove his shoes as he approached the burning bush. The second is his compassion. This is seen very clearly in the way that it tells how he has heard the cry of Israel and has determined to set them free. The third was that where we are lacking, God always supplies the needed strength. When Moses expressed his inadequacy, God assured him that he would carry him through. Our third question is, how did God intend to deal with the enemies of his people? The answer is very simple. He would smite them with wonders, which we find in verses 19 and 20. If you know the story, you know that 10 plagues followed, and none of them were pleasant. These first 3 have been pretty clear and simple, but it's the 4th question where I want to spend the most time. The question is, does God consistently work in this manner? Obviously, God doesn't usually speak to people out of burning bushes, but he does consistently work with people both directly and individually, as well as in a group through their leadership. You should be able to find examples of this very easily throughout the scriptures. But here's another question. What about the way God dealt with his people in regard to their captivity and their affliction? Is that something that he does consistently? The same day that I read Exodus chapter 3, I also read Psalm 10, 40, 70, 100, and 130. Look what I found. Psalm 10 begins with the psalmist crying out to the Lord, asking why he seems to hide himself in times of trouble. He goes on to describe the affliction of the wicked against the poor, but the psalm ends with the psalmist declaring, Lord, thou hast heard the desire of the humble. This is very similar to Exodus 3, where it tells us that God heard the cry of his people in their affliction. Psalm 40 gets right to the point. Here it says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock, and established my goings. Psalm 70 is actually a prayer for deliverance. It is a beautiful example of how David sought God's deliverance and at the same time sought to praise and glorify the Lord. Verse 4 says, "Let all those that seek thee rejoice and be glad in thee, and let such as love thy salvation say continually, Let God be magnified." Psalm 100 is a song of praise. Psalm 130 expresses the hope that God's children can have as they wait for His deliverance. Verse 7 says, "Let Israel hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is mercy, and with Him is plenteous redemption." So you see that in each of these passages, God reaffirmed that this is the way He works. He hears our cry and He delivers. He also gives us hope and instructions for what we should do during our time of waiting. This is an important part of our daily quiet time, looking for truths that are consistently taught in all of the passages that we're reading. It may not always be as clear as this example, and you certainly don't want to make an application where there isn't one, but you may be surprised at how often God allows us to read passages that sort of back each other up because He has a specific truth about Himself or the way He works that He wants us to see. Question number 5. How is He working this out in current situations? Consider how this is taking place in the world, in the church, in your personal ministry, and in your life. Do you know of people or churches that are facing affliction, oppression, or persecution? What about you? Are you facing these things in your life? What is God doing? Are you praying about these situations? Are you willing to be used of God to deliver people in these situations, just as He used Moses? Very important questions. Don't forget to take time to consider God's ways. That's all for today. I hope that you're enjoying these videos and that they're beneficial to your quiet time. Our next segment will look at what does this passage teach me about how God wants me to interact with others. Until then, dig deep.